There is so much to unpack with a film like Groundhog Day, but one of the first questions on everybody's lips is simply this: how long is Phil stuck in the loop? This is a question that has a lot of different answers, depending on who you ask, and one that Danny Rubin, the film's writer, spent a lot of time talking about in his book, How to Write Groundhog Day. Because asking this question can lead to some really interesting insights into how the screenplay developed. For a little bit of background here, Danny Rubin wrote the initial screenplay. It was then bought, and subsequent revisions were made by both Rubin and Ramis. Also, there was at least one period where Rubin visited with Bill Murray, and Murray contributed to the script. Plus, there was improvisation from Murray and others while on location that made it into the shooting script and final movie. The original screenplay for Groundhog Day is a combination of two separate ideas from Rubin. He was thinking a lot about immortality and wondering, if a person managed to live more than one lifetime, could they eventually change their ways? Could a bad person become a good person? Could a selfish man become a generous man? In his book, How to Write Groundhog Day, he talks about reading Anne Rice's vampire novels and describes the vampire characters as being basically humans but with some of the rules changed. And this was something that he wanted to kind of explore. Then he combined this preoccupation with a pitch he'd written several years earlier with the working title Time Machine, about a man who gets accidentally stuck living the same day over and over again. So you can see from this that the writer's intention from the start is that Phil Connors is trapped in the loop for far longer than a natural human life. In the first version, there's even a strand of the plot where Phil Connors is using a bookshelf in Mrs. Lancaster's bed and breakfast to count the days he's been in the loop. He reads one page from a book every morning, starting with the very top left and working his way down. He says at one point, "I've been living in this town for 16 novels, 12 books of poetry, 9 history books, 20 romance novels, the Time Life series on home improvement, and Holly Lancaster's high school yearbook, and still nobody seems to know my name." Using this line as a guide, by even the most conservative estimate, that's over 100 years, probably closer to 200 or 300 if you assume that some of those are going to be larger books with over 1,000 pages. And in this version of the screenplay, we watch as Phil slowly completes the row, then the shelf, and finally the last book in the room. This is also a version of the story that starts with the loop already happening at the very beginning of the film. There are loads of other differences in this initial script, and we're going to talk all about them later in the series, especially when we compare with Palm Springs. But over subsequent revisions, any explicit counting of time was removed, leaving the real total ambiguous. But there are a few ways that Groundhog fans have found to game it out. Firstly, by my observation, in the final cut of the film, we see a minimum of 33 unique days. And that's from me literally sitting with the movie and my counter, clicking every time a scene followed from the last that couldn't possibly be on the same day. But of course, the film implies that there are a lot of loops in between these sequences that we don't see. In 2008, Malcolm Gladwell popularized this idea that you need 10,000 hours of effort to become a master of a skill. And people use ideas like this as well to estimate the loops. Given that we see Phil go from complete beginner piano to playing Rachmaninoff and pretty impressive bluesy jazz, he becomes a master ice sculptor and learns at least some French. Assuming around 6 hours of practice per day, that's about 4.5 years per skill learned. So depending on how fluent you believe he is in French, that gives us, as a minimum, somewhere between 10 and 15 years. And that's before accounting for all the time he spends manipulating women, stealing from banks, killing himself, and doing good deeds. According to Rubin, Ramis believed that the loops last about 10 years, which more or less aligns with the skill mastering assessment. While at times the studio heads might have told you that the whole film takes place over 2 weeks. Possibly they thought that the longer timelines Rubin had imagined were too bleak, or that audiences would have a hard time accepting them. There seems to have been a bit of tension like this throughout the process between Rubin, a still relatively inexperienced screenwriter, who's written something very unusual that he cares a great deal about, and the studio, whose job it is to make it palatable to a broad audience, with Harold Ramis in the middle, helping to guide everyone and make the best film they can. This tension with the studio is also clear when it comes to the other most obvious question: what causes the time loops? From the start, Rubin felt it wasn't important and that leaving it unexplained would keep the focus on Phil's character. I totally agree, although in hindsight that's easy. But at the time, the studio didn't. And he did actually have to come up with several explanations, including a scene where Phil is quite literally cursed by a gypsy. Stripped of any explicit explanation for the looping, Groundhog Day is free to just play in the space. We experience Phil's emotional journey rather than having him be preoccupied with trying to solve a mystery. At the same time, the final film employs some really elegant shorthand that satisfies our curiosity: the pencil experiment, Phil's inability to leave town, and how he tests his boundaries with authority and social norms. And all of this is done without him trying to assign blame, right? Or like offhandedly mentioning that Punxsutawney has a nuclear power plant or a secret government super collider. So we have a director who says it takes 10 years, a writer who says it takes hundreds of years, a studio that wants it to be a couple of weeks, and the film itself, which gives us a hard minimum of 1 month. But the beauty of Groundhog Day, perhaps its greatest quality, is that we will never know for sure. I would argue, as many others have, that what truly defines Groundhog Day, what earns it its place as one of the greatest examples of modern Hollywood cinema, is what it chooses to leave out. The film's complete disinterest in time travel forces us to look at what's right in front of us. A small town and its people, Phil and his interactions with others, his developing feelings for Rita, and his eventual transformation. While none of these elements are incompatible with a movie that's more concerned with discovering the loop's scientific cause or getting to the bottom of some supernatural mystery, right? Like, you can do both things, as we'll see. They would necessarily have to give up some screen time. Even in Frank Capra's Christmas masterpiece, It's a Wonderful Life, whose influence on Groundhog Day is clear, we do learn a lot about the angel Clarence and his motivations and the mechanics of the situation that is, strictly speaking, superfluous to George Bailey's emotional journey. And in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, the story that is kind of the most likely common ancestor for both of these movies, Scrooge's visions and apparent time travel are caused by benevolent spirits with a clear goal. We come to understand exactly how and why it's happening. But in Groundhog Day, it's just the emotional journey. Pure, distilled character development, filling every minute of the runtime. This decision, whether its creators realized at the time or not, imbues Groundhog Day with a deeply, broadly relatable quality. And this is why I wanted to start with this question, because this is a fundamental kind of bedrock thing to understanding and discussing this movie, and it will come up again in future episodes. So as you might have figured out by now, the real answer to the question, how long is Phil stuck in the time loop, is who cares? It doesn't matter. In fact, the very lack of an answer is the point. Happy Groundhog Day to anyone who celebrates. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the movie, I've got a whole deep dive series on my channel. I start by dissecting the film itself, then expand into a history and kind of exploration of time loop stories in other films. Check it out.